the vapor of it all. It's a chasing of the wind, the substance of the form, so pale and thin. Let the veil of her be stretched again.
Well, good morning. We are on location right across the street from our house. We have the privilege of getting to live on the Wisconsin River. One of the things that I love the most about living on the Wisconsin River is at the tail end of the summer, when the conditions are just right, as the nighttime temps dip cold enough and the contrast between the air temperature and the water temperature is great enough, you end up with what we have, which is a mist or a vapor that starts to rise off of the water. It's perfect illustration for exactly what the writer of James is talking about in the passage that we're going to look at this morning. And so we wanted to film on location because you can't get a better real life example than what we have behind us. Especially as we move into the fall, this will begin happening almost every morning. And it's such a great, powerful reminder of the truth that we're about to talk about. So here's what James says in our passage this morning. It's James chapter 4, starting in verse 13. He says this. Now again, James, he doesn't pull any punches. He tells it like it is, and he's not afraid to make us a little bit uncomfortable. Same is true with this passage. So he says in James 4, verse 13, he says, "Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we're going to go to a certain town and we will stay there a year. We'll do business there and we'll make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It is here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it." This passage that we just read, I think, is actually meant to be read in conjunction with last week's passage. It's right on the heels of last week's passage, and even though there's a paragraph break and there's a break in the heading that we find in our scripture, in our Bible translation, those headings, they can be helpful for us sometimes, but that's not inspired truth. Those were added after the fact. And so actually, I want to read last week's passage because I think the point of this morning's passage is actually connected to the meaning of last week's passage. So last week we read James 4, 11 and 12, which says, "Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you are criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or to destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbor?" See, I think actually what's going on in this week's passage and in last week's passage, it's really two sides of the same coin. And if you remember last week, we talked about the fact that there's this desire in all of us as human beings to, the passage that we just read that was from last week, James is saying, you want to pick up the gavel and you want to be the righteous judge, but there's only one righteous judge, and that's God. That's not our role. And we can tend to have this amnesia, or this forgetfulness about whose role is what. It's this desire for us to be in the driver's seat, to pick up the gavel and to be the righteous judge, which is what we talked about last week. That goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve wanted the goodness of God without having to submit to the lordship of God. They wanted to be in charge of their own life. And James, last week we discovered, was pushing back on that, going, you're not the righteous judge. There's only one who's fit to hold the gavel, and it's not you, it's God. And then he's continuing in the same vein this week, going, you want to be self-determining. You want to say, hey, today I'm going to go here or I'm going to go there, and I'm going to do business and I'm going to turn a profit and I'm going to do whatever I want. And he's going, hey, listen, Your life is not actually your own. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. Your life is actually like the morning fog. It's here today and it's gone tomorrow. And there's this constant push for us, or this constant pull for us as human beings in our brokenness. We want to be in charge. We want to be in charge and be able to judge other people. And we want to be in charge and be able to be self-directed and to make our own decisions. Adam and Eve wanted to be able to determine and define what was good on their own terms, their own definition, rather than submitting to what God's desire was in defining the good. And James is pushing back on that hard. And he's saying, listen, that's not the way that this works. That if you're going to choose to follow Jesus, what it means to choose to follow Jesus is we don't get the luxury of just saying, hey, today I'm going to go do this and tomorrow I'm going to go do that and I'm going to just call the shots in my own life. But to follow Jesus means that I've surrendered my life. I've laid down my life. It's no longer I that lives, but it's Christ that lives inside of me. And so I don't call those shots. I don't do those things on my own. I have to have a different posture towards my life. And my posture towards my life needs to understand that my life is like a vapor. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. In just a few, I don't know if it'll be minutes or if it'll be hours, but at some point this mist that's rising up off the water is going to dissipate. It's going to be burned up by the sun. The sun's going to warm the temperature and that mist is going to be gone. And that's our life. And that's the point of these two passages and the point of this morning. James is putting our life in perspective. He's reminding us of what's actually going on. Now here's what he's not doing. He's not saying that, oh yeah, your life is like a vapor, meaning it doesn't have importance. If anything, it's the opposite of that. Our life is brief. We only have small moments, but they're a gift from God. And James is trying to put that in perspective for us, so that we're not cavalier about the lives that we have, but rather we place value and importance on the life that we have in light of who God is and in light of what He wants to do. Here's the deal about, this mist that we have in the background on the water. That's a water vapor. Water vapor, steam, is actually, it's really, really powerful, and it has the ability to accomplish a whole lot when it functions within certain parameters. When you pressurize steam, this is where we get steam engines, the steam locomotive, or steam engines for ships back in the day. I mean, that technology, that transformed life on so many levels, the way that we were able to pursue manufacturing, the way that we were able to pursue travel and all kinds of different things. When water vapor, when steam is forced into certain boundaries, there is great power and great effectiveness that can happen. And this is what James is saying. James is framing all of this up, and he's saying, listen, you want to just go wherever you want to go and do whatever you want to do, but that's not what it means to be human, and that's not what it means to be a follower of Jesus. When you and I can actually do what James said, what he told us we ought to be saying is, we ought to say, if the Lord wants us to. And what that is a huge phrase. That phrase, if the Lord wants us to, that's putting our life in proper perspective. That's putting the water vapor into the proper parameters and the proper boundaries. And when we do that, there is great power to our lives. Our lives get swept up into a story that's greater than our own. And what we need to understand is, this is the end for which we were created. Aristotle used the word telos, which meant basically all of humanity is working towards one particular goal, one particular purpose. And this is the telos of humanity. It's the reason for which we were created, that our lives would be swept up into the glory of God, that our lives would be swept up into a purpose greater than our own. On our own, our lives are just a vapor. They're here today and they're gone tomorrow. But when we yield to Jesus, when we surrender to Him, when we do what James says and we do what we ought to do, which is to say, if the Lord wills, I'll go here and I'll do that, and I learn to locate my story in the story of God, all of a sudden I'm caught up in something so much greater than myself. There's deeper purpose and there's deeper meaning, and I can understand that I actually live and I breathe and I work and I build and I even die to the glory of God. There is a beauty in that. There is a freedom in that. I mean, it's difficult because I don't dictate and I don't determine. I'm not self-determined the way that Adam and Eve wanted to be, the way that I want to be every day. But there's something so much more powerful than that that we can live towards. So James isn't saying that your life is a vapor, it's worthless and it's meaningless. He's saying, listen, our lives are a vapor. Let's not be arrogant. Let's realize who we are in the story, what our role is. Our role as human beings in general, and to follow Jesus just means that we lean into that, is that we're servants. The language of if the Lord wills, if God desires, then I'll go and I'll do these things. That is the language not of a self-directed, self-determining man or woman. That is the language of a servant. The language of somebody who's submitted to the lordship of Jesus. The language of a servant is somebody who wakes up every morning and goes, hey, I don't call my own shots, but I do whatever my master wants. Jesus is the King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords. And so for us to understand that this is the end for which we were created, this is the life for which we were created, there's freedom and beauty that comes from that. The other side of that is James is also not saying that we shouldn't plan. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying we shouldn't have vision, we shouldn't make plans, we shouldn't dream dreams. No, he's talking about the posture of our hearts when we make plans, the posture of our hearts when we dream dreams and when we have vision. That's what's important for us. The posture of our heart all through it is, hey, listen, God can do with my life whatever it is that he wants to do with my life because he's in charge. He can use me to do great things, or he can have me labor in obscurity. That's his call, and I'm submitted to that, whatever it is that he asks me to do. And so the goal of this passage in James is to help us get to the place of what Ruth Haley Barton, who is a spiritual director and an author, she calls it holy indifference. And that can sound like a negative term, but she means it in a positive light. Let me read you a passage of what she writes about this idea of indifference in the context of listening for God's desire, listening for God's agenda. She says that indifference is a positive term, signifying that I am indifferent to anything but God's instruction. This is interior freedom, or a state of openness to God in which we are free from undue attachment to any particular outcome. There is a capacity to relinquish whatever might keep us from choosing God and choosing love. And we have come to a place where we want God and God's direction more than anything. More than ego gratification, more than wanting to look good in the eyes of others, more than personal ownership, more than comfort or advantage. We ask God to bring us to a place where we want God's will, nothing more, nothing less, nothing else, so that we can pray the prayer of indifference that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but thine be done. See, that's really what it all comes down to. It comes down to what Jesus exemplified for us in the Garden of Eden. He brought his request to God. He wanted things to go a certain way. If you remember, Jesus struggled in the garden. He said, listen, if there's any way for this cup to pass, I want the cup to pass. That's my desire, God. But then he followed it up with, but you know what, God, in the end, it's not my will that matters, but it's your will that matters the most. Jesus, that's his way of phrasing what James put this way. Hey, if the Lord wills, if it's the Lord's desire, then I'll go here and I'll do this. This is what God is calling you and I to. He's calling you and I to a life of surrender, a life of openness, a life of what Ruth Haley Barton refers to as divine indifference, a holy indifference, where God, we just want what you want. We don't have a horse in this race. We just want what you want for us. So this morning, where are you at with that? Where are you at with the desires of your heart? Again, it's not that we can't have those desires, but what's our posture in the middle of having those desires? Are we able to locate those desires in the greater context of the fact that God has a plan that He's working out? I'll never forget probably one of the most poignant and I would say pivotal moments for me as a young man learning this concept that my life is not my own. And I think I've told this story before, but I was 19 years old, and I had always, since the time I was a very young child, cared very deeply about getting married and about having kids. There's home video footage of me as a kid talking about, when I have kids, I'm going to do this with them and I'm going to do that. And I thought all the time about getting married, kind of almost in weird ways, to where as an elementary age kid, where I shouldn't have been thinking about what would be best for my future wife, I was actually deciding what dreams I wanted to pursue based on what would be good. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and somebody told me, an adult told me, "Ooh, that's kind of a hard life on your family if you're going to be in the military." And I remember thinking, as I think a fifth grader, you know what? Yeah, maybe I don't want to be a military pilot anymore, because that might be really hard on my wife and on my kids. You know, I'm not sure how normal that is or how healthy that is, but there's something really deep inside me that wanted to be a husband, wanted to be a father. And I remember as a 19-year-old kid praying for my future wife and asking for God to shape her into the kind of woman she needed to be, and to shape me into the kind of man that I needed to be. And I will never forget, in a moment of quiet, praying for those kinds of things, I heard God speak to me. Not in an audible voice, but a distinct impression. Almost, it was a whisper, but it felt like a shout in my heart and in my mind. And I remember praying for my future spouse, and then I remember this very simple question coming into my heart and in my mind. And the question was, who said that you're going to be married? And I was pacing back and forth praying, and I remember stopping in my tracks. I knew it was not a thought from me. I knew that it was God. And I knew that I didn't have an answer to that question. In that moment, I knew I had been living the equivalent of what James said, of saying, hey, today or tomorrow, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do business, and it's going to look like this, and we're going to turn a profit, and I'm going to find a wife, and we're going to be an it couple, and it's going to be awesome. And God, would you just bless my plans for my life? And I knew that I was guilty in that moment of being cavalier, wanting to be self-directed. And God, in His goodness, gently pushed back and was showing me that, no, actually your role is to figure out if it's my desire for you to have a wife and to have a family. You don't know that. And you might need to put a little bit of a tag on your prayer for a wife or for a spouse or for children. Say, God, and it's not just a balancing statement, it's a heart posture, and my life was missing that heart posture. I was making really big assumptions. And I'll tell you, it took me days to wrestle through that, to get to a place where I could actually let go of that dream and to say, God, I still desire to be married and I still desire to have children, but if that's not your desire, help me to be the kind of man who can surrender that to you. Help me to be the kind of man who can be open to whatever it is that you have for me, and to realize that I live for your glory, whatever the circumstances of my life happen to be. So this morning, where are you at? What is the posture of your life? Are you running around making grand plans, never stopping to think, wait a second, what is it that God wants for me? Do you need to reframe your life in light of the morning vapor or the morning mist that's here today, and gone tomorrow. It doesn't mean we crumple up all of our plans and all of our dreams. No, it just means that we need to bring those before God and we need to surrender those things to Him. We need to trust that the best thing we can do for our life is to allow our life to be caught up, swept up, even brought within the parameters of God's loving will and His loving plan. So this morning we're going to celebrate communion. And as we celebrate communion, Eric's going to come in just a moment here and he's going to lead us through that. But as we celebrate communion, there's no better way for us to frame up this reality of who God is and who we are, to not get those things confused. Because in celebrating communion, we're celebrating the fact that we have submitted our lives to the Lordship of Christ. That's how we gain access into salvation, is by laying down our lives, that we can have the life of Jesus for our life, that we can lay down our brokenness and our sinfulness and our self-directed ways, and we can take up the power and the authority and the freedom that comes through Jesus. But it only comes by dying to ourselves so that we can live new lives through Jesus Christ. So this morning, as we celebrate communion, I want us to ask ourselves some tough questions. I want us to ask, God, are there any areas in my life that I'm just assuming that I'm still in the driver's seat of my own life, and you're wanting me to lay those things down? You're wanting me to surrender to what you might want for me and for my life. Are there dreams that I need to surrender? Is there a posture in my heart? Is it a general posture in my life that I'm arrogant, like James said, and I'm going, yep, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do this and it's going to look like this? Or are there some specific areas? Maybe most of my life is surrendered to God, but maybe there are some very specific things where God's going, hey, you're still holding that with a closed fist. You're still running around acting like it's your call to make. So in communion, what we do is we move from head knowledge, what James said at the end. What did he finish with at the end of this passage? He says, so anyone who knows the good that they ought to do but doesn't do it, to them it's sin. And we're going to make sure that we're not living in sin. We're going to make sure that we're not people who, yeah, I know I should be surrendered to God. I know that He's the one that's in charge. I know that my life is like a morning mist and it's here today and it's gone tomorrow. But then I go ahead and I just keep living that way. No, let's take time to make sure that we don't just know that to be true. But let's make sure that in the nitty-gritty details of our lives, we're putting it into practice. We're laying down our lives and surrendering to Him. So Eric's going to come. Let's spend some time in quiet reflection, and let's trust that the Spirit of God is going to be good enough not only to reveal those areas to us, but He's also going to be gentle and He's going to be loving as He works through with us this ongoing surrender and submission to His Lordship. God is good. God is good. And He'll gently lead us to a place of locating our story in His grand story.